Welcome to Getting Ghosted. This is an Intuitive Soul Collective podcast, and I'm your host, Allie Horner. Hello, everyone. We're back to do another episode of the Getting Ghosted podcast. If you have not heard yet, just really quick, I did start another podcast. It is called Afterlife Interviews, the Women That History Tried to Erase, and it's all about women from the other side coming in and telling us about the things that they wish they had known when they were alive. These are all women from history. Some of them were in your history books, some of them were not. And so many of these women wanted to share their true stories and true perspectives from the other side. And so go ahead and give that a listen and like and subscribe, and you'll be able to find more of that on Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. For this week's episode, one of the things I wanted to cover a little bit more was our friend from 200 Years in the Future. Her name is Anna, and she is popping back in for part 2 of our little interview with her. And so one of the things that she had shared last time was about renewable energy, how important it is for spiritual awakenings, things they have in the future that we might not have here, how things have evolved, at least in that current time frame, and where things are heading for the most part. And she came back just now and is popping in so I can, kind of ask her some more questions, and let's just see what she's got for us. So she's showing me they're like almost like huts or pods. And she said, we have more green spaces that are more merged with nature. And she said, I believe you'd call it solar punk, but it's not really like that. And she said, now much of the earth has not quite evolved quite toward this way yet. And she said, but there are more and more communities growing where they grow in harmony with the earth. And she's showing me images of homes that are built into certain woodland structures. Like she's showing me trees growing up through the middle of homes being built in conjunction with, it's almost like trees. I don't know how to describe this. Trees like surrounding the home. And she said, we do a lot more eco-friendly housing, but remember that these sustainable practices, she said, they've taken quite a while to come online. And she said, there's also like a whole economic design criteria. And she said there's like a higher education learning that you can get starting. She's showing me it can start in middle school, actually, that kids can select this in middle school. And she said kids from every country can kind of like come together to talk about the logistics of this. And she said it's there's been widespread droughts. And she said, and there were some famines. Or like widespread droughts led to partial famines. And she said, and there's some things that have been shifting very slowly, but they are shifting enough to where humans have been noticing it. And she said, I don't want anyone to freak out because obviously we're all still here in the future. And she said the population has been slightly, she said it's less populated, but not like drastically. It's just a little bit less populated. So this is for many reasons, not just the droughts. She said mostly selective conditioning. And she said a lot of people selected and inherited traits that were, she said there was some changes. Like some people inherited some traits where they were unable to continue having families or having children. So there's some things that changed there as well. And she said, now this isn't necessarily like bad or good. She just said it was just kind of part of what happened. And she said there were some droughts and some shifts that happened because of the climate change. So a lot of countries came together to change and shift things. And she said, she was like, you had some people asking you about how we live in the future, right? Like what housing's like and things like that. And I said, yeah, there were some people who emailed in and commented and asked questions about this when I posted it on TikTok. And she said, yeah, and she was like, I want to come and answer some of that. So she's aware of things that, like telepathically aware of things that I had seen in my comment section without me directly asking her, which I think is super neat. And she said, I was able to see that because we already have that telepathic connection. So in a sense, what you know, I know. And I was like, okay. And she said, so we have normal home structures. There are more multifamily dwellings. So this has become a lot more popular. And she said, there have been a lot of antitrust laws passed as well. And she said, as far as like larger corporations, and she said this there's a lot of laws and legislation, rulings that passed. And she said, culturally and globally, there have been changes in this. And she said, so some of what began to happen over the last 2 centuries was that people began, family sizes dropped down in many areas. And so she said, so many people began to live in multi-generational housing. This helped a lot with economic prosperity. It also helped with the renewable energy focus because it's easier to bring in renewable energy and conserve some of the Earth's resources when you don't have as high a population that requires so many resources. There was also a change away from factory farming. She said, to answer your question, yes, some people do still eat meat. And she said, I tried to emphasize that before, but it's more so that people have been moving away from meat eating. So it's more regulated now. And she said, and also it's more organic, and we don't just slap labels on things. Like she said, in the past, there was something that they had learned through some of her energy studies and courses about how back in our day, people could say, oh, that was a free range chicken, but it wasn't technically. There was a lot of skirting around things. And she said, they could say it's grass fed, and it's well, that doesn't mean it got to go outside and be on the grass. It just means it was grass fed, a grass fed beef or whatever. And she said, so it's really important that there's ethics and policies in place. And she said, I want to reassure people that change is coming, but you were part of creating it, your generation, your people who are alive now. And she's pointing to us. She said, there's been a whole revolutionary change over time with this, but some of it came about quite rampantly because of some certain things that made it more difficult for many of us to eat meat. And she said, it was more like a number of things that happened. It's not just one event, right? And I said, yeah, as history tends to be. And she said, right, it's very few and far between that there's one event in history that causes something. She said, now your history books taught you otherwise, but that's not really true. Everything has a cause and effect. And I was like, right. And she said, we kind of naturally understand that. There's a lot of people in your country at your time that understand this, but they also don't acknowledge it. She said many people think that their lives won't have any effect on anyone in your time period, and that's kind of a cultural conditioning change that has come into play. And she said this is not the case in our time period in the future. We all understand things very differently. And she said, of course, there are some people who kind of balk at things, but they do understand better here. I was like, oh, okay, that's good to hear. And so she said, so now back to the housing, because many of our practices have changed, we have shifted into different housing. She said, yes, we do still have cities, but they're more economically friendly. They're more, she's showing a lot of she's showing there being more people able to grow gardens on rooftops, vertical gardens out on the side, on the sides of the roads. And she said, we have more pedestrian friendly zones and spaces as well. She said, we planted over many of the streets and removed some of the paving so that they're more pedestrian friendly and more friendly for farming. She's showing there being more and more green spaces in areas. And she said a lot of the cities, people still dwell in them, but they don't live in them to the same degree, but some people do. She says it's not as many as before. It's not as many as you would think, but she said more of us have moved into areas where we can be among the trees. She said there's more restorative camps and places and that style of healthcare where people are in nature more for restorative healing. And she said, now this is not the only way that we recover or recuperate, but we live our lives as such where we don't need to seek out nature. We are more one with it. She said, this is again, she said, the way you guys live now, you're in your cars most of the time. We don't really do as much of that. She said, we spend more time in public transportation and we have higher forms of public transportation. She's showing fast track trains, bullet trains. And she said they are very economically friendly and they're very wonderful to look at and to be on. She said people pay a premium for luxurious long train rides as well, where she said they're almost like tourism things. People will buy really expensive tickets. And she said so that they can go on these long train rides and see all areas of the country. She said, this is sort of a thing in certain areas, but she said it's very popular in their time frame. And I asked her, so like when it comes to the housing, she said, well, she was like, well, there's not too much more to say. She said, we just live more in harmony with nature now. So she said, it's been a quite sustainable change. She said, there are groups of people who are living off the earth more than others, of course, like it's kind of to each his own, but there are certain regulations and rules against using land for things that would be harmful to the waterways, to the rivers. She said like there are owners' property rights, but there's also more individualization and there's less, she said like corporate ownership of, she said corporations can't own properties and lands to the same extent. They can use them, but they don't own them. And I said, well, who owns them? And they said, well, there's wilderness committees. She said there's more wilderness and land protection rights. And she said, so that prevents a lot of corporations from like functioning the same way and from like owning things outright in the way that they are. And I said, so what about these private equity firms and investors? And she said, well, we still have some of those, but they're heavily regulated. They don't have the same rights. She said, of course, there's still some degree of like consumer driven economy. And she said, but it's very different. It's more sustainable. And she is showing me how things are made. And she said, we don't really use our resources the same way, though we do still need to have resources. Because it's only 200 years in the future, there's been technological advances and upgrades, but it's not like so different just yet. Now, the other piece she's showing me is, she said, I want to talk a little bit more about spiritually, like animal and pet communication. And I was like, oh, fun. Okay. And she said, so that's really growing in your time period. When we learn about history, she said, one of my friends works in veterinary work. And I was like, oh, that's really neat. And she's like showing me an image of her in my mind. And she said, this friend, one of the things she had shared with me that she learned about was how much our time period led into a great change in which over the coming decades, there would be a really large change in animal communication. She said, no, it's not going to be widespread right away, but it's going to be growing, and it started to grow around your time period. And I said, oh my gosh, my guide said that this was going to be happening, and I'm actually seeing more of it. And she said, yes, that's exactly it. It's going to become more popular. And she said that her friend had learned that more and more vets began to have intuitions about the animals they were treating, and farmers, ranchers, pet owners. But essentially there was this great change because many of them began to hear the pets or the animals' thoughts. And they began to be able to converse with them. And it created a shift in medicine and medicinal practices. And I said, I was like, that's really neat, because that it seems to be kind of an issue, not being able to understand our pets, not knowing what's wrong, things like that. And she said, that's exactly it. And so there started to be a change. She said, now not everyone uses that ability, but it's much more widespread in our time period. And it's more well known. It's not considered very woo-woo or taboo anymore. And I was like, and so like, is spirituality considered taboo? And she kind of laughed and she was like, no, she was like, people have different spiritual beliefs and practices, just as you do in your time period, but we're more acclimated to the spiritual or psychic senses now. And she said, many of them have become more common. They're not as, weird like they are in your time frame. And she said, but there was a very large boom. So one of the things that happened is they started to create more ways of structuring the psychic and mediumship and sensitive fields so that you could suss people out more. And she said, I think that's how you'd say it, like suss them out, test them. She's showing testing. And she said, not because people shouldn't be psychics or mediums and shouldn't be able to practice and explore their gifts and their abilities. And she said, we just consider them the norm. And she said, now not everyone has them or uses them or really dabbles in that. She said, but, we understand that everyone has intuitions. And the other piece she's showing me is it's sort of more regulated around them, but not like regulated, just like, she said there is some structure around it. And, like she said, so when people have businesses that are connected to those fields, like animal communication, telepathy, psychic, readings. And she said, which we do differently. We don't have as much future prediction now. We do more reading and clearing of energy, like reading people's auras, reading people's energetic fields to do energetic clearing work. And she said, now that's not the only way we do things, but it's more well-known, more widespread. And she said it's more accepted. It's not considered woo-woo or weird or too futuristic. It's just considered sort of natural for people to do energy balancing. And she's showing them going into this, like, she said we call them kind of like healing tanks or pods. And it looks like they lay in there and there's some sort of light and sound in there. And she's saying it sort of recalibrates the cells. And she said, no, it's not a cure-all. It's not just a pure healing machine, but it's more common knowledge that you can work on your psychic senses and just kind of be at peace with them here. Like, we don't see that as weird or taboo. She keeps using the word taboo. And she said it's not considered strange. Now the other piece is, I was like, wait a minute, go back to like the testing. So there's testing for psychics. And she said, oh yes, they have to go, many of them have to go through rounds of testing if that's to be their profession. And she said, now it's not like controlled, right? And she said, but it's to keep people from taking advantage. And she said, now that said, most people here don't see psychics and mediums always to predict the future, though that does happen. She said most of them see psychics or mediums to communicate with the other side, which we understand is just another, like a higher dimensional realm. And there is more spiritual thought process. She said there's certainly some people that aren't on board with that, but our science has really evolved quite a bit to where we know that many of, our loved ones are very much still alive, but in a different form. And I was like, that is really neat. I love that. And she said, yeah, it's kind of cool. It's super sweet. It's just, she said, but we're not dwelling on them to that degree. And there is still some fear of death here, and fear of passing on. And people do get devastated. There are accidents. There are, she said homicides. There's homicides. She said, we have, and I said, is there still suicide? Are there still a lot of suicides? And she said, oh yes. And she said, but we have elected suicide. And she said, I believe you would call it, something similar to, she's saying like drug assisted suicide. And I said, right. I said, I get what, I understand what you're talking about. Like, I was like, where people elect, like they're sick or, they're not, able to get to a point where they're going to be able to live their life and be okay here. And she said, yes, that's more common and much more widespread. And she said, now people don't elect it that much. We have different, healing abilities, and we do a little more preventative work than you're able to do in your time frame, which actually mitigates a lot of those issues that would cause people to feel that way. But people do choose it from time to time. And she said, for example, if there's like a spinal fracture and the person can't come back from that and can't have the use of their hands, their legs, and there's, for some reason, our technology is unable to repair the spinal cord. And I was like, you can repair the spinal cord there? Like, I was like, how do you do that? And she said, well, there's, AI has actually helped us to come up with certain solutions. And she said there were certain spiritual interventions as well, but we can't heal everything. And she said, we are able to do more with our technology to help certain things. Like she said, we can regenerate discs and we can regrow bones in different ways and formats. She said, we have more preventative measures as well here. But she is showing me, it's really neat what she's showing me. I'm like, oh my gosh. She's showing me things just like repairing themselves inside the body. And it's like this blue light. And she said, now that said, she said something about the word plasma. She said, now that said, we can't fix everything, and not everyone wants everything healed. People have autonomy and they do have a say in their own healing or their own journey here. And so she said, so yes, there is sometimes accidents and there are certain things where that person can't come back from that injury or can't come back from that illness or that accident, right? And she said, again, there are homicides, but she said, again, we have more preventative measures here. And she said, I won't go into that right now at this time. And I was like, oh, that would be interesting to hear about how that field has changed. And she said, I know, but there's only so much I'm allowed to disclose at this time. And she said, I'll have to ask. So I think I remember saying this last time, but she's kind of referencing having to ask people things like, am I allowed to do this? What can I share? What should I share? And she said, it's more about our responsibility to you in the past. And she said, so what I want you to hear and know now for you that are in the past is that you do have more power at your fingertips than you think. And there's more sustainable abilities and energetic capabilities that you have right at your fingertips than you can imagine. But your population is coming into sort of, she said it's kind of, she said it's a shift. And so she said there are more things that will need to happen for you to fully awaken and for humanity to fully like rise up. And she's showing rising up like people protesting. And she said to change the systems at play from these systems where they've kind of thwarted your power to you growing into your autonomy and sovereignty. And she said, and also compassion. And she's showing me, she said, many of you began to have sort of a revolutionary spirit, which led into this change, but many of you also had to choose to think differently. And there are many young thinkers in your time frames who will be born in the next, she's saying like 50 years, but some of them are already here on the planet, and some of them will be coming soon. She said many of them, as they get into their teens and 20s, will become very revolutionary thinkers and will help bridge the gap between where you are and where we will be. She said, she said Rome wasn't built in a day. So she said, keep in mind that as the systems and structures change there, that things will have to break down before they can be built up in a new and better way. Sometimes you have to clear the deck. Like she's showing like someone playing checkers or chess and sweeping the board. And she said that's important sometimes, that you have to sort of start from scratch. And she said, now, I don't want you to think devastation and panic, because that's not how it goes. And she said, but sometimes there are areas in your time frames where it's going to feel like that, but it's not like a full meltdown breakdown. It's just going to feel like, okay, what are we going to do now? And she's showing she said a lot of the corrupt governmental systems you have had there for a long time are beginning to shift and change. So that's going to be something you have to work out over time. And she said, I know many of you understand what we mean by that. And I said, yeah, I have my guesses. And she is saying, there will be more people that kind of come to realize this, and there will be great change in your time frame. And she said, but I have not studied it in detail. She said, it was not one of my areas of study or focus. And I said, what do you mean, like our historical, like political changes? And she said, yes, that was something we glossed over in school. But she said, to be honest, it's not a big feature in our historical lessons. And I said, oh, really? And she said, yeah, not as much. She said, we more focused on the global economic changes and the way that the shifts in temperature on the planet began to sort of change how your systems and structures worked on Earth in terms of mind, body, soul, and how the renewable energy and technology evolution came afoot. She said that was more my study and area of focus because it was far more important for me and for many of us in our schooling and classes. And she said, our governmental systems have quite changed, so we don't really have the same systems that you would have. They're quite different. And she said they're much more autonomous and much more comprehensive. She said they really work for the people more. And she said, of course, there's certain regions where people elect or opt out of them or have their own sort of economy. And she said, but there's much more on the world economy that is much more fruitful. And she said, because we've learned to work together much better. And she said that, but it took time to get to a point of stabilization. And we're still human. There are still issues and disagreements, but we come to faster, swifter resolutions in our time period. And she said, now, don't ask me how that happens, but there is a lot of change that comes afoot over time with the renewable energy crisis. Many people have to band together to deal with the energy crises that are happening on the planet in your time frame, which causes some changes and advancements in technology quite quickly that she said instigate changes on a global scale. And this is when we see more of these governmental systems and different countries. She's showing different countries like swapping technology, sharing plant-based culture. She's showing food, and that's so neat. Like using different plant matter as fuel. And she said, this is something, she said, organic matter is much more sustainable than using some of what you have used on the planet at your point in time. And so she said, this is something that I can't go into much. And she said, we're much more solar technology than plant, but there is a way to use organic matter and rid yourselves of food waste, which will come about shortly. And she said, the technology is not quite advanced enough yet for you there on the planet, like in your time on the planet, to like really work with that. And she said, we also have new advances in technology that allow us to use more sustainable transportation. And this has really changed how we get around. And she said, we do have fast travel. We can also choose slower travel. But she said, we have much more sustainable roadways and ways that things work in terms of the clean energy. We have I said, do you still have so many cars? Like, do you guys still? She said, well, yes, we do have vehicles, like individual vehicles. But she said, many of us have to elect to have, she's showing like a program where, that's so neat. There's like a program with, you have to like dock your hours or dock your time on the roadway and in the car. She said it can be quite a nuisance. So the public transport is much better and more recognized in terms of transportation. And she said it works quite efficiently. So it's much more sustainable. It makes it much easier for us to get around. And she said it's less cumbersome. And she said, but we do have vehicles and fleets that move things from place to place. And it keeps the roadways clearer to have it sort of this way. She's showing me like some sort of system where they either automatically track how often you're using the vehicle, or she said the sustainable future is built on people really understanding and comprehending how all of your cars and your gasolines and the fossil fuels, etc., are really eating away at your ability to think clearly. She said you can't even smell clearly because there's so much of that in the air. And she said even people who are in natural spaces, like when you're out in the mountains, right? And she said, you live in Colorado? And I said, yes. And she said, when you're in the mountains, you smell fresher air, it's clearer. I said, yes. And she said, but still there's too much density, too much air pollution for you all to really smell things that clearly. And she said, it's not like that for us here. She said, now there are population control issues in some parts of our future, in some parts of the world, but we don't police that. She said, and because of that, there have been necessary changes made to shift the energy resources. And she said, and because of that, people's taste buds and smell centers, their sense of smell, and she's showing me smell centers as in like parts of the nose. So she's pointing out particular parts in the anatomy of the nose and the brain. And she said, these senses became heightened because the air was clearer for us. It became clearer. She's showing me, not long before she was born. So it took some time. And she said, but it was a long change. It was happening in advance. It was something that was being worked on for quite some time. The other piece she said is this renewable energy sector and the changes in the economic growth, these both went hand in hand and fueled and changed how we think about creating and consuming. And she said, as a people, the human population is very consumed with this need to always be on, always be creating. And she said this started to dwindle because people started to realize like we have to find different ways to fuel an economy. And if the economy won't work without the cycle going on of create, consume, then we need to find a better, more sustainable economic model. And she's saying this began to change. She said about 150 years after I was born, and I'm 40 right now. So in the year 2026. So about another 100-ish years from now. And she said, but the thing is, it began to slowly change prior to that. And she said, your generation will begin to see the slowing economic change, but it's not going to be overnight. She said, of course, we do still have some of that, consumerism still here, but it's not quite to the same effect. And we're much more sustainable with our culture. And she said, this has left us less burdened and we have more time to simply exist, which frees up energy stores and energy resources. And she said, we also think about work and the economy very differently because we have much more sustainable resources here. And she said, so we don't think about work the same way because if you have more sustainable resources, you don't need money in the same way that you do there. And she said, our currency has changed quite a bit, but it's not quite, she said, it's not like, I was like, it's not like a dystopian future. Like people are like worried about that. And I was like, I don't see that happening as a psychic. She was like, no, that's not how it goes. And she said, but there were some wars. And she said, as you know, in your time frame, wars kind of happen when certain people are in charge and they are throwing their swords around or throwing their egos around or think that they should have this and they want to own that. And she said, there is still some of that issue, but it's not, she said it's much more contained. It's much more, they keep a lid on it a lot more. And she said people work together much more. And she said a lot of this has to do with the technological advances and economic advances that allow some of the smaller economies to work in a way that sustains them without forfeiting happiness and well-being to survive. Like they don't have to work themselves to death. And she said, so things have changed quite a bit. But this isn't all over the world. Like people still have choice in how they work and how they live. Some people choose to work themselves very hard. And she said, but there's less reward for that. And it's much more understood that that's not part of preventative medicine. And she said in our time frame, 200 years in the future is, to understand how bad work is when you are, she said, you do have choice, but it's bad for your body. It's bad for your back. And she's showing someone with a hobbling around with their back. She said, and that's just like the basics of it. And she said, we don't have as many autoimmune conditions and flares as you would have in your time frame because we have outgrown those because of our sustainable support systems and because of our preventative healthcare. She said, we don't even quite call it preventative healthcare. It's just, we have more of a knowledge of how the preventative systems and how the overall wellness needs of the population and the earth work together and grow together. Yeah, and she's showing me let's take a break here, and then I will come back and I will do a part 3 again here soon. If you have questions for Anna from 200 years in our future-ish, actually 220 years-ish in the future, feel free to send them in to intuitivesoulcollective.com. You'll see links for the podcast there. And I hope you guys enjoyed part 2 of this interview. Wanted to also mention, if you are interested, I have 2 courses open. They will start in June. And one is called The Art of Channeling. You're going to learn how to lucid or clear conduit channel, as well as to get some beginner trance channeling experience in there. It's a really good one. If you are like, I want to bring through messages from the other side or from my loved ones and guides really clearly without stopping and like listening clairaudiently or having to translate things. And instead, you're just speaking writing and letting them kind of speak through you. So think like Abraham Hicks and Bashar, as well as there's other people who do these things as well. If you're wanting to do that and speak more seamlessly and you have some prior experience with mediumship and connecting with guides and loved ones, at least beginner mediumship, it might be a good course for you. So check that out. It starts in June. And my other course that starts in June is the art of Autowriting. Autowriting is the process by which you kind of allow yourself to, or your conscious mind to step aside and you let go. And instead you allow your higher self, a higher being. It could be your team of light, a loved one on the other side, or a spiritual guide, someone from history who is on the other side who wants to bring you messages of love, wisdom, encouragement. They get to come through and they use your hand to write through you. And we will be practicing pen to paper and we'll be practicing typing. Now, this is really great for people who are like, well, I really want to work on that building that relationship with my guides and spirit, with transmitting these higher messages or transmitting deeper concepts, and getting into a writing flow. We'll also practice some intuitive writing. So this is really great for anyone who wants to be a messenger for people on the other side, or who just feels that they have the energy of something bigger from their higher self or their soul, a bigger idea that's trying to come through them. And they want to kind of learn how to get out of the way and let it flow through their writing. So this is great for people who just want to work with the other side in a new way, or who feel called to write a book, poems, songs, feel called to write concepts, scripts, whatever it is. You can auto write a lot of things, and you've probably seen it in action out in the world way more than you know. There's a lot of famous writers and songwriters and musicians who have used auto writing throughout the centuries, and it's just not they don't always talk about it, but if you look around, you can find it hiding in plain sight. So I hope that you will come and join us for that one as well. That is in June. And yes, you can take both courses if you feel called. This one is open to really anyone, beginner to intermediate level. And yeah, it should be a ton of fun. I hope you guys will check it out. I've linked everything in the show notes. And hope to see you soon.